Hello, everyone, and welcome to Blogging Theology. And today I'm delighted to talk again and welcome back Dr. Abdullah Ali. You're most welcome, sir. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam. Paul, of course, it's always a pleasure to have the opportunity to sit with you and to, of course, engage your audience. I know that
Yes.
you read comments and get a lot of good praise and then of course sometimes a lot of criticism. But mashallah, as always, I really do appreciate your channel. And I do think it's well deserved. Gets well deserved attention for all of the different type of guests that you have come on here. So,
not least your good self, of course. And for those who don't know, Dr. Ali is Professor of Islamic Law and the Prophetic Tradition at the famous Zaytuna College in California. Now, what really prompted me to invite Dr. Abdullah Ali on today was an article that you kindly posted on your website and other social media platforms. It wasn't a very long article, but I thought it was remarkable for its clarity, robust position. You weren't trying to sugarcoat anything, and you were asked a question by someone, a Muslim, and it really had to do with, may a Muslim who has undergone sex change surgery identify as the opposite sex? So that really sums up, I think, what you were asked. But I'll just, with your permission, read the question out to you and then invite you to perhaps tell us about your answer, which was extremely interesting. So you were asked, a man at our mosque had sex change surgery before his conversion to Islam and now identifies as a woman. He wears women's attire and is allowed to pray in the women's prayer space. Those around him affirm him in his delusion and claim that he is remorseful for his decision and has made tawbah, that is, he's repented to God for it. Many of us, however, consider this a baseless argument, since it seems that a proper tawbah would entail identifying as one's biological sex. Do you agree with this assessment? That was the question to you. How did you respond?
Well, I responded in a number of ways, but I guess in short, the fundamental question of Toba was that, that I don't consider this to be a proper Toba, that my assessment was the same as the questioner's assessment. And the word Toba itself actually originates from a verb, taba yatubu, which means to return. And the idea that a person committed a sin prior to Islam and then continued to commit the sin after Islam and claims that they're remorseful and they've made Toba or repented for it itself is a bit ridiculous, right? Because it goes against the linguistic indication of what Toba is, and also goes against the legal definition of Toba. Now, of course, people with gender dysphoria, among other things, that these people, I think that as Muslims, we should see them as people who are, they're not well, right? These people are not well generally. And I think that it doesn't help them, or rather it doesn't help us to be able to help them to necessarily, I guess you would say, demonize them, right? But at the same time, we have an obligation to ensure that we help them to return to reality, right? Or rather to embrace things as they truly are, right? And so when you find Muslims advocating for normalization, right, of the fiction, right, related to gender dysphoria, or people who actually suffer from such diseases and such states, that in itself, it really causes great harm, right, to society, to humanity, among other things, right? So, and
right. So, what is the Quran's position about gender and biological sex? I mean, does it have a clear statement, a clear position?
Yeah, the Quran is very clear. Multiple verses throughout the Quran. There's the gender binary, sexual binary is repeated, and really, there's not much difference between sex and gender. We become accustomed to this idea that sex is one thing and gender is something different because of postmodern philosophy connected to this new sort of gender theology, sometimes it's called that, which technically emerged in the 60s and is connected with feminist theology as well, to some extent, but of course this is sort of run amok a bit, so much to the extent that even what we can, even if we can call it regular gay people, are really turned off by it. But many feminists are also turned off by it as well, because now it's okay. Now we were trying to liberate ourselves from men, and now we have men claiming that they're women, and that they could sue us for discrimination if we refuse to refer to them as women, and refuse to refer to them or use certain pronouns when we're speaking about them. And so the Quran is very clear. The Quran, that it's male and female, right? They're boys. When you're born, you're a boy or you're a girl. Even when we find things that may not, apparently or in its physical appearance, look like something as direct and clear as a male or female, right? Like, for instance, we could talk about the hermaphrodite, or sometimes we call the intersex category of person. That the scholars historically did not say that, okay, this is a third category or the third gender. Right. This is not the way that they treated those type of anomalies. They rather accepted the gender binary, which was emphasized, or it's established and reinforced in the Quran in multiple verses. And they would say, okay, well, we have to do as much as we can to try to discern what particular sex or gender this particular category or this particular type of person belongs to, right? So they had different tests, which they utilized to try to determine that, even though they're less empirical or scientific, they're sort of pseudoscience that they were utilizing during that time. Today we have better methods to determine this definitively, but the scholars, they didn't give up on the gender binary, right? So when you hear Muslims talking about there's a problem with the gender binary, they need to understand that this is undermining Islamic fundamental teachings about the reality of the world. But even beyond that, it's actually non-science. It's anti-scientific, right? Science doesn't support it.
Presumably you're referring there to DNA, for example, which is pretty not culturally relative. It's not given to opinion or anything like that. It's kind of is just an objective scientific fact. It just is what it is. Yeah,
exactly. Right. So XX or XY chromosomes, and of course you may hit some variations, XXY, things like that. But the XXY, I saw someone comment that, okay, well, what about XXY people? And I said, well, those people, the Y itself proves that this is a male, that this is an individual. Individuals may have certain deformities, right? Genetic deformities. That still doesn't exclude them from the general category of the XX and XXY binary, which is upheld in science. So, and now, of course, my argument is not really as much a scientific argument. That is to say that I'm not saying, okay, well, that these people are what they are because of what science says or because of their chromosomes. I'm just sort of making an additional point about that. Okay, well, the I guess you say the strongest indication, the clearest indication of a person's sex are one's chromosomes. We know that through science, right? But even if we were to argue from a non-scientific or a less scientific sort of criteria or standard, right, using a religious or a legal standard, right, of Islam, we wouldn't go with it either, right? That that we utilize the traditional methods that scholars utilize, sort of the pseudo-scientific methods to determine that that one, we have to conclude, okay, that these people are or belong to either one of the two categories of people that we know. And that two, if an individual has their genitalia removed, that itself does not change the fact that they belong to one or the other category of person.
Right. So it's upon which they were initially created in the womb and when they were born and so on, and which we can know through DNA rather than any further. Okay, you made a very interesting statement, which I didn't realize until I read it. You said, furthermore, while it is often claimed that such procedures, these are the medical, physical procedures that some transgender or transsexual persons undergo, while it's often claimed that such procedures are necessary to prevent suicide, there is plenty of empirical data and statistics showing that suicide rates rise rather than fall among people after they transition. This is very interesting because it seems to be a central claim of the lobby groups that promote this kind of activity, that in fact it prevents suicide. But you're saying the evidence is the opposite.
Yeah, exactly. It is. It's actually the opposite, that the more people who supposedly transition actually, they are more prone to suicidal thoughts and tendencies and even attempts or even successful attempts than prior to the so-called physical changes that actually are done to their bodies. And so many people regret these things. And young children, they may suffer from gender dysphoria, and they don't know any better, but often what happens in most of the cases is that they grow out of it, right? But what's happening today is that, and alhamdulillah, it looks like that at least most of the planet is sort of moving back to a sense of normalcy on these topics.
It seems to be that way, especially with the victory of Trump recently, representing a movement against it, representing many things, but at least in part a movement against this kind of so-called radical, progressive, liberal, woke practices and ideologies. There seems to be a reaction in America against that, for sure.
Right, exactly. So there's just a move back in that direction, and I would add, those who argue that these particular procedures are necessary for the psychological health of these people. I like to ask people, okay, well, what do you base that idea on? Where do you best base this claim on? Right? Have there been scientific experiments done prior to these particular procedures being carried out on human beings? I mean, no, I don't think anyone can claim that they discovered a sexually confused monkey, right? In the jungle, right? Who, okay, this monkey actually thinks it's actually a female. So we're going to remove his genitalia. And so we discovered that after we removed the genitalia, that now the monkey and everything is normal and has a healthy psyche, right? I say, how do you prove that? You can't prove that scientifically, because typically that's what's supposed to happen, is that with the scientific method, before you actually start to speak of things in such factual terms, right? Then you have to demonstrate through experimentation that this is what will help, right? But fundamentally we bought into the idea that, okay, it will help, or we believe it's going to help, right? Therefore we should do it, right? Even though we don't have the empirical evidence to actually support this idea. But then it turns out the opposite of that most cases, the vast majority of the cases actually turn out, they move in the opposite direction. And quite a number of people actually regret that they actually have removed limbs from their body or added new limbs to their bodies, and they want to transition back to what they were. And the classic case of this is there's an old case called the John Jones case, which it's a man. His name was David Raymer. I believe he committed suicide in 2004. But in the 1960s, there were two twin boys that were born, and one of their circumcisions was actually botched, right? It's the botched circumcision. He was close to 2 years old, or around 2 years old at the time. And so the people in the scientific community, quote unquote, at the time believed that gender was a psychosomatic state. In other words, gender is largely about, your brain, right? So they believe that if we actually bring this boy up, right, as a girl, he actually accepted eventually, So what they did is they did some further reconstruction, right, of his genitalia, tried to make him look like a girl. They started to dress him in dresses and other things like that. And they tried, and would give him hormones. Excuse me, I'm sorry, giving hormones after a certain number of years. And then the particular experiment was hailed a success. But for about 30 years, what they hid from the public was that the boy actually rejected the experiment from the very beginning, right? They tried to make him play with toys, which are typically girl toys. They tried to make him put on lipstick, and so he rejected. He wanted to shave, like he saw his father shaving. He wanted to shave as opposed to play with a Barbie doll or put on lipstick, among other things. So once it came out, okay, that he was rejecting the experiment from the very beginning and actually felt for a very long time that there's something wrong. Then when they asked him finally, okay, what do you want to do? He decided, okay, I'll transition back. Say they sort of reinstalled some type of genitalia to him, male genitalia, a phalanx, and then eventually got into relationships, but suffered in those relationships, and then fell into really deep depression and eventually committed suicide. I believe is in 2004. So this is an important case, both for homosexuality and with respect to transgenderism. But it was a case that homosexuals, they loved it, especially, and also feminists loved it too, because the idea was that most of the ideas we have about sexual differences are culturally inspired as opposed to biological, right? So, yeah.
Wow, that's a very shocking story you told. I have actually heard that before, and awful abuse of an innocent human being there. Shocking.
Yes, right.
You also say in your article, obscured gendered people and hermaphrodites are not foreign to Islam and Muslim society. Effeminate men, masculine women, and hermaphrodites have special rulings in Islamic law. Could you just talk us through what some of those rulings might be? That's starting with effeminate men and then masculine women and hermaphrodites.
Right. So in the Arabic language, in connection to Islamic law, you have one word for, we call it effeminate man or woman. So we call it a mukhannath. The mukhannath is a word for an effeminate man. And then for the hermaphrodite is khunta, right? So they have a similar root, right? Khanatha, right? They're related. So, excuse me, I'm sorry. So the Quran in Surah An-Nur, which is Surah 24, some of the verses they speak about, okay, what type of who in whose presence can women sort of expose themselves, right? So it goes in and lists a number of people.
But when he's exposing themselves, you mean not wear hijab, perhaps?
Not wear hijab, and
anything more.
Hijab and perhaps certain other parts, maybe their shins and maybe their forearms, things like that. So you have, there's a list of people given, right? In that verse, fathers, brothers, children, things like that, right? Nephews and nieces, and it goes on and mentioned one category. It mentioned, of course, young boys who haven't reached into puberty. And they mentioned ulul irrati min ar-rijali, and which basically translates as asexual men, right? Asexual men, right? So there were these people, and in particular, there's one popular story in the seerah of the Prophet ﷺ, where this is a man who was believed to be asexual, right? That he was very effeminate from a very young age. He was born and had these effeminate characteristics about him. And the Prophet used to allow for him to spend time in the presence of his wives, right? And they would be uncovered as well, right? So the assumption was that this particular man doesn't have sexual desire, right? So he can spend time in the presence of women, even with their hijabs not on. Until one day, the Prophet entered the house of one of his wives, where this man was. Some say his name was Heat, some it was Matar. There's a number of different mentions of what his actual name was. So he mentioned to a man, Prophet entered to one of his wife's house. The man was there with his other wives, and the Prophet had another man with him as well. So this effeminate man, who they believed to be asexual, he mentioned to this man who was accompanying the Prophet, peace be upon him, he said to him, "Oh, when you all go to Hunain, when you go to meet the Hawazin in battle, then you should look up this woman. Her name is such and such, right? So when she approaches, she this many layers of fat. When she turns around from the backside, he has this many layers of fat, right?" And so when the Prophet heard that, he said, he understands what's in here. He understands what's in here. In other words, that this was a man who actually clearly understood the type of things that a man are attracted to with respect to a woman's body, right? So because of that, the Prophet actually expelled him from his home and said, okay, he's never to return. Now, he was very poor at the same time. So the Prophet's wives pleaded with him, saying that, okay, he's poor. Can he at least come on Fridays to eat with us, right? So the Prophet, he allowed for him to do that. So to come to him only on Fridays to eat with him, but again, there was an understanding that, okay, there were certain people who they believed to have been born with certain sort of abnormal characteristics. And they assumed, if it was an example, for instance, an effeminate man, that this is the man who didn't have sexual desire. And the same thing if it was an effeminate woman. I haven't identified, or I can't recall any stories about effeminate women during the time of the prophet, peace be upon him. But what we do know is that the prophet, he cursed men who wore the clothing of women, the attire of women, and he cursed men who wore the attire and women who wore the attire of men. And so when we look in the commentaries on this particular hadith, the scholars say, okay, there are two different types of effeminate men and effeminate women. Some of them are actually born with a particular disposition that actually inclines them towards the cultural characteristics of men or women.
So they're not choosing to. They're not acting that way. They're not pretending. They're not trying to make, be theatrical or something. This is something that they are naturally, in inverted commas, disposed to be like. It's something they have no control over.
Right. Exactly. Right. So they say that the hadith is not talking about these type of people, right? So these are people that have, there may be their certain mannerisms, feminine mannerisms. They may have the gait of a woman when they walk. They may have even the way that they speak, a feminine way that they speak, similar to that of women. Normally, what women would speak that way. So that when the prophet curses people who do this, he says he's not talking about them. So men who actually imitate women and women who imitate men. Men who wear the attire of women and women who wear the attire of men, that he actually cursed those people. So they say that what the direct or the object of the curse are those people who actually take on those characteristics, that they weren't born that way, that there was no way for us to believe or assume that there is something anomalous happening, with their birth through their genes or whatever it may be. So when people actually transition to, I was a man and I acted this way, now I'm acting like the woman, right? So he said, this is the direct or the object of the curse, and this is
or so-called drag queens, which unfortunately are quite common in Western society, even in libraries, teaching children or performing. It's all over the place now. That obviously would be fall under that curse, because that's obviously very deliberate, intentional.
Right, exactly. Right. So that's with regard to the effeminate man and effeminate woman. But then also when it comes to hermaphrodite, the hermaphrodite, of course, individual is born with both sexual organs. And true hermaphrodites actually are extremely rare, right?
I was going to say, they must be.
In other words, so a true hermaphrodite is one who actually boasts internal and external genitalia. So, in other words, someone who has ovaries and the male gonads, along with the male testes and the woman's vagina, things like that. That's extremely rare, right? That where there's actually both internal and an external sort of like correspondence between those things. But most hermaphrodites can be classified as what we call pseudo hermaphrodites, meaning that internally they belong to one sex, but externally they have both sexual organs. So in the old days, the scholars, when they were asked questions about how do we know what particular sex these people belong to, right? They would say, like for instance, as a popular fatwa given by Ali ibn Abi Talib, karramallahu wajhah, which is that, okay, well, you base it on what particular organ they urinate from, right? So then some of the people ask them, okay, well, this particular person urinates from both organs, right? What then, right? So then they will say, okay, well, then we'll wait and let them grow into puberty, right? And they'll say things like, okay, well, if he grows a beard, mustache, okay, the man, if it, if it grows breasts, right, and it has a menstrual cycle, as a woman. Right. And then they say, well, what if both of those things happen? Then of course, they would eventually classify the individual as what we call al-khuntha mushkil, the problematic or the obscure gendered individual. Right. And because of that, they would say that when, let's say, for instance, when it comes to inheritance law, right? Because inheritance, if one of their family members die, and let's say you leave siblings, and one of them is a normal person and the other was a hermaphrodite, And then if this is, say, for instance, a boy and then a hermaphrodite, so the boy is going to get the share that the boy receives. The hermaphrodite is going to get a different share. It's not going to be the same amount that the boy receives. It could be, for example, half of what a boy receives plus half of what a girl receives. And when it comes to like inheritance law, they also say things like, hey, those type of people can't get married, right? They can't get married. Why not? Because we don't know what sex they belong to, right? Right.
Yeah.
So because if we were to permit for them to get married, we actually may be promoting homosexual marriages, right? Yeah. So there are a number of other rulings, similar to that you see they emerge in the Islamic law.
Extraordinary. So basically, Islam is, in the kind of wider comparative religious arena, a traditional religion. And so it would find there'd be much to overlap with traditional Catholic teaching, for example. I don't mean liberal Catholics or those who are so-called progressive. I mean the actual teaching of the church on this subject. I know Pope Francis has said that, has railed sometimes against this kind of ideology in the West, which is often promoted globally and often tied to foreign aid to African countries. They've got to kind of change their policies to get foreign aid and so on from the West. And I would imagine a number of traditional Jews and other religions, even perhaps people with little religion at all, may instinctively support this traditional perspective. But there's just one, I mean, slightly off topic, one thing that's slightly, there are hadiths which speak of, and again, I'm not a scholar, so I may have misinterpreted the hadith, which seem to speak of a time when Muslims would follow Christians and Jews down the same rabbit hole, or down the same hole that the snake went down or something. And if I've understood that rightly, is this a prediction or a prophecy that this traditional integrity that I just outlined, shared by the religions, will ultimately crumble? And this is forecast or prophesied, or is that, have I misunderstood it?
No, I think that's a proper understanding of the hadith. I mean, it mentions a lizard's hole, right? So if they were to follow them down a lizard's hole, then you would follow them. So in the same way, so if Jews and Christians themselves have abandoned traditional morality or the revealed morality given to them by God, then Muslims are also going to do the same, right? That they would follow them in a similar fashion, if not worse, right? Because the hadith, a number of narrations of the hadith talk about, okay, well, they started off with, could that's the hadith of the 70 sects or the 73 sects as well, which is also in line with this whole idea that Muslims would follow the ways of their predecessors among the other religious groups who actually received revelation from God. So it's definitely a big problem, and I think it is good that you bring that up, because I didn't just sit around the other day and just say, okay, well, let me write something about transgenders in the mosque and things like that. That actually, I actually received a phone call from a brother who I know, and he was very concerned because there's a masjid where there's a man who has been given a particular post in the masjid, an important post, and that man continues to identify as a woman. And when he confronted the custodians of the masjid about this issue, they claimed that they actually had a fatwa which supported their position of allowing the person to remain in the position and actually being in charge of da'wah, right, of all things, right? Of like sort of Islamic propagation and sort of missionary activity in the masjid, right? So it's a really, really big problem. And one would think that at this point that Muslims, especially in America, especially after recent events and the direction that it seems that the country and the world seems to be going in, that we would have given up these ideas and stopped trying to cling to things that further undermine our religion. They undermine society. We become very unscientific in our approach to things, and it shows that we have a serious crisis of leadership. Right? I think like this issue is just simply a symptom of a larger crisis or problem, like of leadership that we have in our community. I shouldn't be the only person, right, saying these things, right?
Are you saying you are the only person saying these things, more or less?
Well, yeah, I think I'm the very first person to say that a person is not allowed to identify by their new adopted sex. I haven't seen any fatwas that said that. Right. I think I'm the very person, and I could be wrong. Maybe I just haven't looked close, close enough to anything. But I think that a lot of people know that, but no one's really said it. Right? No one's really said it. If anything, I've actually seen some exchanges by people who are identified as scholars say things like, well, this this individual can live as the sex to which he or she transitioned to, right? And I was actually shocked to see this stuff. Like, actually, after posting this fatwa, I had one scholar sent me something from another scholar, or a person who identified as a scholar in the Muslim community, and I was just really shocked to see it. And in some ways, not completely shocked, because I saw some of this similar type of statements from this individual in the past, which were overly accommodating to both gays and to the transgender community. And it's just unfortunate that people continue to sort of move upon that same path. And so it's really troubling to me that to see that we're still there in certain parts of the country.
Well, then, in my personal opinion, you are to be commended for your bravery and to speak so clearly in a very principled way from Islamic texts, the sources, the Quran and the Sunnah. It seems to be, we've discussed hadith. The Prophet Muhammad, upon him peace, cursed certain kinds of behavior, and you spoke about the binary form of our species, male and female. That's in the Quran. So the sources appear to be very clear and unambiguous. And yes, there are difficult cases in reality, but the ones you mentioned, like the hermaphrodite, are extremely rare. These are not kind of day-to-day troubling conundrums that, these are not, the usual fare of our experience. These are exceptions rather than any normative realities that our sources allude to. So, thank you very, very much for sharing that, actually. And I will link to the article, the main article on your website, which we've been speaking from, so to speak, the question and answer, so people can see that and other material on your website as well. So thank you very much for that. Do you have any concluding words you want to share before we finish?
No, I believe I would just really just reiterate just the importance of Muslims sort of taking a step back and, I guess you'd say, calming down about, this is a type of hysteria, I guess you'd say, that exists among a lot of our national leaders in the United States in particular, and we are very, very reactionary to political events, to cultural events, and we need to give ourselves an opportunity to digest certain things. I think that one of the fundamental problems is that too many of our masajid are run by technocrats, and what I mean by that is, of course, they're doctors, they're engineers, there are, of course, people in IT, and people who, and again, I'm not saying all of them, but often I think there's an idea that Islam is not like it's not something that someone requires like true, like profound knowledge of, right, before you take a leadership position or take a strong position, politically or otherwise, and so the imams are working there, and they often are censored or told that certain topics you're not allowed to speak about, and so they're salaried people. These individuals control their salaries, and they're often silenced, right? But sometimes,
but to be fair for a second, I can't speak for these people in London, for example. I've spoken. I'll be very careful here about what I say because, but there is a senior imam of a certain senior mosque in London who told me privately that he won't or can't talk about certain subjects on Friday during the khutbah because he had a very real concern. Firstly, that mobs would attack the mosque. He literally would be physically attacked, and also that he could be prosecuted under the laws. And what he might want to have said is just normative Islamic doctrine. It's not in any way radical. It's just So he remained silent on certain subjects to do with, say, LGBT, particularly.
Right.
And I've had guests on this channel, very distinguished scholars, who have told me before we recorded, not yourself, I hasten to add, that they won't touch certain subjects like LGBT because, they have a mortgage, they have a job at certain places, which I won't mention because it would give a game away. But and I respect that, by the way. I'm not in their shoes. Who am I to judge? And I'm not judging.
Right.
Really, because who knows what the consequences for their families could be, as well as if they lose their jobs and other horrible things. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that these pressures are real, and these individuals are not cowards necessarily at all. They're people who have to balance up their responsibilities and what they can and cannot do if they're to survive in the so-called free West, which is anything but free, by the way, in many areas. If you're pro-Palestinian, if you're this, there are lots of things you can't be without often severe consequences, even legal consequences, especially legal consequences. You can be prosecuted.
I totally sympathize with that, and I do think it is a bit different in the United States, when you compare us to like places like England or other parts of Western Europe, right? Well, Eastern Europe as well, but. And that's why I focus on like the custodians of the mosques, those the boards of the different mosques, like in America, because I would say that those are really the main people who are actually suppressing, principled voices, right? They threaten, people are threatened, to say certain things. Now, sometimes you do find scholars and imams who actually simply agree with this stuff, right? They, for whatever reason, it may be, maybe they just don't have a good sort of, I guess you'd say, feel for what's happening culturally and politically, and so they are kind of a bit more impressionable when it comes to some of these things, And I do think that's an extremely important point that you make here about trade-offs and people making calculated decisions. Right? I don't speak to every single issue either, right? That I could speak to. And part of the reason is that I don't want to bring any negative attention to my place of employment, right? As well, right? But there are definitely a lot of thoughts that I have, a lot of things I would love to say, right? But I said, no, I'm not going to do that because it would place my, the institution at risk. And so everyone makes those sort of calls. And I think that's important because I find like a certain level of immaturity in the Muslim sphere, who they act as if, especially on X or Twitter. Like Twitter is like perhaps one of the worst places for this. It sort of, but it's a good place to demonstrate what I'm talking about. Is that people think you're supposed to risk everything, right? You're a scholar, you're supposed to risk everything. And most of the people who actually are saying things like that are usually anonymous. Right.
Yes, and usually about 15, I suspect, in as well, 15 years old. Or maybe not these days, maybe a bit older. No, you're absolutely right. I think that people who do achieve prominence and responsibilities like you do, you're not just a scholar. You are part of an institution which you have responsibilities towards. You're not free just to say whatever you want, and indeed that's maturity to recognize that and to live accordingly, rather than we're not all adolescents who can just do anything we want and on Twitter. We have,
and governments do the same thing. That's also that's the other thing. So Muslim governments, there's always a lot of criticism of Muslim governments, and I say to myself, well, Muslim governments have interests as well, right? They have interests. They have they have things that they're hazards to certain positions that they would take. There's some people who think that every Muslim government should come out and attack Israel, right? Militarily, that's what they should do. And I said, well, I don't blame people for the government. Governments decided, okay, well, I'm not willing to risk that. It's like, well, what are the consequences? What will be the consequences of that? Are my people ready for this? Right? What type of suffering will that bring upon my people, for example? And we can talk about, okay, well, if it was me, everybody's always, if it was me, I would do such and such. But it's not you, right? You're not in the situation, and you don't see what they see. You don't interact with the people they interact with. And of course, that's not me trying to justify inaction, right, from anyone, any type of pressure that can be applied, that should be applied. But I do think this is an extremely important matter. And so, and I guess the last thing I'll say about this with respect to America is that I remember when I was younger, like Muslims used to say that, well, the people who I used to interact with in the masajid used to say it's haram for you to be involved with politics. It's haram for you to vote, right? Then all of a sudden something changed. And I think I mentioned this before in an earlier interview that we did this. Yeah. And so I said, well, and then all of a sudden things change, and all of a sudden it becomes compulsory to vote, right? But then beyond that, it becomes compulsory to vote for a certain person, or a certain party, right? And if you vote for this party, this particular person, then you're going to hell. If you vote for that person, then you're okay. And the thing that's interesting here, and again, and I'm not trying to belittle the plight of the Palestinians, right, and the issue of Palestine at all, right? But throughout the time that I've seen Muslims engage in politics in the United States, it seems that the only non-negotiable has always been the issue of Philistine, right? As if to say that the only thing that only principle that you are not allowed to violate, right, is support for the Palestinians, right? And it's almost like, okay, so in the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that he will forgive everything except for shirk, right? Except for idolatry, except that you associate partners with him. And so as if like politics has become like a new sort of like theology type of thing. So you can support a candidate or party if they support Palestine, but that means you can also, so that permits for you to tolerate gender affirming care, right? For you to tolerate, sort of late term abortions, for you to tolerate
like the Green Party in America, which supports all of those, but nevertheless, they're excellent on Palestine, and therefore that we overlook absolutely everything else.
Right, exactly. Whereas on the other hand, they said, well, there are all these other issues as well, right? Perhaps, and again, that's important. That is an important issue, but it shouldn't be the basis of like a type of cultural takfir, right? In other words, like, okay, I'm going to vote for this other guy, right? Because I think that there are issues which, are much more, a greater immediate concern and consequential concern, right? At least, long term, rather, because that's the way I try to think. I try to think about long term effects of issues, right? And I try not to think as an individual who only is interested in one particular matter, right? And so a person would say, well, that individual supports the Zionists, so it's okay. So you're not really a good Muslim. You're not a good Muslim because you're supporting someone who supports the Zionists. But I always tell the people, okay, in America, I'm like, who's not a Zionist? Right? Who's not a Zionist in America? Right? I mean, there are a couple of people, maybe one or two people in politics, but everybody's a Zionist right now at this point. That could change. That could change in time, but it's going to take some effort, right, on the part of Muslims, right? So again, the whole idea, again, I think that this fundamental issue of transgender acceptance is just simply a symptom of a larger crisis of leadership that we have in our community that we really have to deal with. And there should be no reason, in my opinion, that today we're still trying to normalize these type of things. And I believe that if brothers in the mosque were aware that this particular individual is actually spending time among women, right, and hugging their wives, right, potentially, again, I don't know that for a fact, but I would assume that this is kind of one of the things that happen, right? You're a woman, okay, let's hug from time to time. That a lot of people would just simply blow their tops, right? They would really just lose it to know that. And it is also not the very first time there where people have attempted to try to incorporate these type of individuals into our community. Like, I mean, of course, we want to accept them, embrace them, but we have to embrace them under the right circumstances, the right terms. And it definitely can't be having them in a leadership position or position which is really crucial for the operations of any religious institution, right? So for their own sake, for their sake, right? They need time to heal, right? And they definitely don't need us like attacking them, right? And so when the community is attacking those type of people, those individuals who put them in those positions of authority or influence, that they are to blame, right, for that, right? And they should think about that deeply.
Gosh, yeah, Huge amount to think about there. So perhaps we'll leave it there. Thank you very much indeed, Dr. Abdullah Ali, for your courageous stance, sticking up for which is basically mainstream normative Islam. It's not in any way a unique position. This is normative Islam. So thank you for that, which in America is controversial, shockingly, but there you go. It's the sign of the times. So thank you very much. And link in the description box below to your website, which contains the article and other important material, including other YouTube videos as well. So thank you very much. Until next time. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam. Thank you, Paul.